They tortured this alien girl until a human blew the lab apart to save her. The cold metal bit into Evra's spine, each breath shallow and jagged against the sterilized air of the Cryan laboratory. Her wrists and ankles were bound in magnetic restraints, her arms splayed in a cruciform position atop the operating table. Bright surgical lights hung overhead, humming softly like the wings of a predator, and the scent of antiseptic stung her nostrils. She had long since stopped flinching at the hum of scanning instruments or the rasp of sterilized gloves snapping into place. Pain was no longer something she feared. It was just the rhythm of her days. Low whir signaled the arrival of the two Cryan scientists. Tall, wiry creatures with pale, ash-gray skin and eyes like black marbles, they glided into the room with their usual clinical detachment. Their mouths never moved much when they spoke. The words came out cold, disembodied, as though funneled through synthetic filters. Subject Z1 shows consistent neuroresilience. One of them remarked, tapping data into a handheld console. Begin neurological sampling phase. Evra didn't move. She couldn't, really not with the paralysis serum numbing most of her body. But she heard it all, every word, every number they used instead of her name. Her name, it was still hers. Wasn't it? Evra. The thought was a whisper in her mind, a fragile ember flickering in a cave of darkness. Sometimes she repeated it silently, like a chant, just to remind herself that she had been something else once. Someone else. Not this ... specimen ... metal tools clinked against the tray nearby. She felt the chill of antiseptic on her temple, then the sharp sting of an incision. Tears welled in her eyes, not from the pain, she was used to that, but from the hopelessness. The Cryans didn't care what she felt. To them, she was a fascinating divergence. Humanoid in form, but possessing a cellular regeneration pattern alien to their science. A perfect puzzle. They would slice her apart, catalog every nerve, and, if she died, they'd just log it as data and retrieve another if any of her kind remained at all. She thought of Alia, her home world. A vast forests with trees older than civilization. Sunlight dappled across mossy glades. The chirr of birds at dawn. Gone. The Cryans had reduced it all to ash and turned her people into fodder for their twisted pursuit of perfection. The scalpel hovered again. Then everything changed. A deep rumble shook the floor beneath the table. The walls trembled. The lights flickered. What? One Cryan began. An instant later, the laboratory door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and debris. Smoke poured into the sterile space, and from it emerged a broad figure clad in black tactical armor, his silhouette backlit by fire and red emergency strobes. A large rifle rested in his hands like an extension of his body. Evra blinked. Was it a hallucination? A final mercy from a dying mind? The Cryans reacted too slowly. 2 shots. The scientists dropped to the floor, lifeless. The figure advanced, his gun still raised. She could see his face now human. Tan skin, a dusting of stubble, blue eyes sharp and alert beneath his helmet. She flinched when he neared. He lowered the weapon. Without a word, he reached for the clamps securing her limbs. His fingers moved with quick precision, undoing latches, disabling fields. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice gravelly and deep. She stared up at him, chest rising and falling. Unsure if she could speak. Her thoughts tumbled in a single shivering current. Then where do I belong? And for the first time in what felt like forever, something inside her stirred something stronger than fear. Hope. The corridor stank of ozone and burnt metal. Evra stumbled, her bare feet slapping against the freezing alloy floors as she tried to keep up with the human who had just pulled her from the edge of oblivion. Her legs were weak. Months without movement had left her body a husk of what it once was, but something in her refused to fall behind. Not now. Not when she had finally been pulled from the jaws of hell. The human moved ahead with purposeful strides, his black armor catching flashes of red emergency light as they passed, shattered bulkheads and the twitching corpses of Cryan guards. His weapon remained raised, sweeping side to side with the easy precision of a soldier who had done this 1,000 times. He glanced back only once, his blue eyes finding hers. "You holding together?" he asked. Evra nodded automatically, though her lungs burned and her vision blurred at the edges. She didn't want to slow him down, didn't want to be dead weight. He turned forward again. "We've got to get to the hangar. That's where your ride out of here is." "My ride?" The words hardly registered. Everything felt surreal each second. A burst of motion, color, and noise stitched together by adrenaline. Evra had dreamt of escape for so long it had become a cruel fantasy, something she clung to in the worst moments just to survive the next cut, the next needle, the next violation. But now, this was real. The sirens, the heat from fires licking at broken conduits, the pulse pounding in her ears. She was really running. They turned a corner and ran headlong into a squad of Cryan soldiers. Time slowed. Evra barely had time to gasp. Before the human was in front of her, a wall of armor and fury. "Get down," he barked. She dropped to her knees as plasma bolts screamed past. The soldier lunged left, firing in smooth, disciplined bursts. 3 Cryans went down before they even registered what was happening. One managed to fire back a shot, grazed the human's arm, the energy sizzling across his plating, but he didn't flinch. He moved like liquid fire, rolling, rising, reloading in a heartbeat. His weapon spat death, and soon the hallway was silent, except for the distant groan of a collapsing bulkhead. Evra stared at the bodies. The smell of scorched flesh clawed at her throat. She hadn't seen death like this, not up close, not with blood on the walls. The human turned and reached for her. "Come on, it's not over yet." His voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't demanding. Just urgent. Alive. She took his hand. They ran again, down another corridor, past more labs with bodies slumped at shattered terminals. One of them, a younger Cryan, barely older than a child by their standards, stared at her with glassy black eyes from behind a cracked observation window. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as she passed. For a moment, Evra felt the tug of memory of her own people, her brothers, her sisters. Gone. Her grip on the human's hand tightened. The final set of blast doors came into view, scorched but intact. The man skidded to a stop, pulled a control panel open, and jabbed at its guts with a multi-tool. Evra stood beside him, heart racing. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. He didn't look up. "Sergeant Ray Novak, United Systems Marine. Corps. Why? Why me?" He looked at her, then really looked. His face was grim, covered in soot and blood. But his eyes were kind, because no one else came for you. And someone damn well should have. The blast doors opened with a hiss dot beyond them. A hangar stretched into the shadows. Sleek Cryan ships gleamed under emergency lights. Ray nodded toward a smaller shuttle tucked behind a transport drone. "That's ours." Evra followed him inside, breath catching as the hatch closed behind them. For the first time in months, she wasn't cold. And for the first time in her life, she was no longer alone. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the shuttle's forward viewport, a sea of glittering silence, broken only by the soft thrum of the vessel's backup engines. Evra sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her knees drawn to her chest, a thermal blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She stared out into the cosmos, as if afraid the stars might vanish. The moment she blinked, Ray sat beside her in the pilot's chair, one arm resting loosely on the throttle, his other hand working the controls with calm, mechanical certainty. He hadn't spoken much since they launched. He hadn't needed to. They were alive. The realization still hadn't fully settled into Evra's bones. Her body ached from exertion, her skin still raw in places where the Cryan restraints had dug deep. But it was the silence, the lack of machines buzzing, no metallic footsteps approaching, no sickening click of vials and bone saws, that unraveled her most. Still with me? Ray's voice broke the quiet. It was low and rough, the kind of voice that had seen war but hadn't forgotten gentleness. Evra nodded. I think so. He glanced at her sideways. You're doing better than most would. I don't feel better. Her voice was a whisper, as if speaking too loud might wake the nightmare again. I feel like I'm still on that table. I keep waiting to open my eyes and find myself strapped down. Ray leaned back in his seat and exhaled. Yeah, I know that feeling. Evra looked over at him, studying the profile of his face sharp. Jaw, faint scars etched like ghost lines across his cheek, a faint stubble lining his chin. He looked like he'd seen 100 battles. Probably had. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at her soft, careful, like he was holding. Something fragile, and didn't want to break it. Why did you come for me? She asked suddenly. Ray didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped a few switches on the dash, adjusted their heading, and only then said, Command didn't send me. I saw the intel leak. Experimental Cryan. Facility. Biological testing. Coordinates matched a dead zone near Cryan territory. He paused. I've seen what they do. I couldn't ignore it. But you didn't even know me. Ray's grip tightened slightly on the controls. Didn't have to. You were someone. Someone who mattered. The words hit Evra harder than she expected. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were the opposite. Simple. Honest. The Cryans had treated her like data, tissue, a curiosity under glass. And now here was this grizzled soldier, talking like she was worth crossing enemy lines for. Silence fell again, but it was warmer now. The kind that said, You're safe here. After a while, Ray stood and moved toward the rear compartment. There. Should be some ration packs in storage, he said. Not fancy, but it'll do. Evra stayed in her seat, still gazing at the stars. Her body felt like a ghost, but her mind buzzed with questions about him, about where they were going, about whether any of her people might still be alive. Ray returned with 2 silver packets, handed one to her. She opened it and nibbled cautiously, her stomach twisting from too many months of chemical drips and starvation. I don't know where I'm supposed to go now, she said softly. The Cryans burned my home, my people. They're probably all gone. Ray looked at her with something deeper than sympathy, understanding. He sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. Then we find somewhere new, he said. Start again. There's more out there than war and ruins. Evra's voice shook. But I'm not the same. I don't even know who I am anymore. Ray leaned forward. You're alive. You fought. You made it out. That's who you are. The rest you'll figure it out. And I'll be here when you do. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, this human who had come for her when no one else would. Who hadn't asked anything of her. Who didn't treat her like data. The stars drifted past the shuttle windows, distant and cold. But in the quiet space between them, something had shifted. A life had been returned. A thread reconnected Dot, and in that fragile beginning, Evra found something she hadn't dared to feel in a very long time. Hope. The hum of the shuttle's engines was soothing, rhythmic, almost like the heartbeat of some great metallic beast carrying them through the void. Evra had drifted into a light sleep, her head resting against the padded wall near the viewport, the emergency blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. But peace never lasted long, not in her world. The first jolt was subtle, a flicker in the lights, a shift in the hum of the engine. Then the entire vessel lurched violently to the side, the restraints snapping taut across Ray's chest as he was thrown forward in the pilot's chair. Warning sirens screamed to life, flashing red across the control console. Evra sat up instantly, heart racing. "What's happening?" she cried. Ray was already moving, hands flying over the controls. "I don't know. Something just grabbed us." Gravitational signature spiked hard. Another jolt hit, more violent than the last. The shuttle pitched forward, and for a terrifying moment, the stars outside twisted, warped like water being pulled down a drain. Evra clutched the armrest, her breathing rapid and shallow. "Is it a black hole?" "No," Ray growled. "Artificial. This is a tractor distortion man-made, or Cryan-made." Her blood turned cold dot outside the viewport. Space rippled unnaturally. Then, like a nightmare emerging from the deep, a vast shadow slid into view. A Cryan warship, sleek, black, monstrous. Its surface shimmered with faint green energy fields, like a serpent cloaked in scales of light. "They found me," she whispered, a lump rising in her throat. "Even out here." Ray's jaw clenched as he slammed a fist against the console. Of course they did. Cryans never leave loose ends. He flicked the switch, trying to fire up the shuttle's primary engines again. They coughed, sputtered, and died. "Main power's gone," he muttered. "They must have hit us with a pulse net before we saw them." Evra turned to him, her voice trembling. "We're adrift." Ray met her eyes. Even in the dim flicker of emergency lighting, his gaze was unshakable. "We're not done yet," he said. She stared at him, at the man who'd pulled her from the lab table, carried her through fire and steel, and brought her back to life. Now, here he was again, defiant, daring fate to try and take her back. A proximity alarm blared. The Cryan warship was closing in. Their boarding hooks would latch soon. Evra could already feel the familiar claws of terror scratching at her chest, threatening to drag her back into the dark. Ray stood, grabbed a sidearm from the wall holster, and checked the charge. "I'll buy you time," he said, voice calm. "No." Evra grabbed his arm. "No, you can't fight them alone. There's too many. I'm not letting them take you. Not after what they did. Not after what we've come through." Then, "Don't," she said, her voice cracking. "Don't fight alone. I'd rather die beside you than be dragged back into that lab." Ray blinked, surprised. Then his shoulders dropped a fraction, and he nodded once. "Then we fight together." A sharp hiss rang out as the Cryan ship made contact, magnetic clamps locking into the shuttle's hull. The air grew still, heavy. With the tension of impending violence, Evra moved to the rear bulkhead where spare tools and panels were stored. Her hands trembled, but she gripped a metal bar like a weapon, heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't strong. She wasn't trained. But she wasn't going back. A crack of energy tore through the shuttle. The side hatch blew open in a cloud of smoke and sparks. Silhouettes poured through Cryan soldiers in sleek battle armor, their weapons glowing with pulse light. The first one stepped forward, and Ray fired. The confined space erupted into chaos. Energy bolts lit the walls. Ray moved like a shadow between them, swift, precise, deadly. Evra ducked low, swinging the metal bar into the knee of one soldier, throwing him off balance. Another fired wildly, striking a console that burst into flame. They fought like trapped animals, desperate, furious, but there were too many. Evra found herself pressed against the wall, Cryan claws inches from her face, when a thunderous voice rang out from the ship's comm system. "Ray, you suicidal idiot. Thought you could start the party without me?" Evra's eyes flew wide. She recognized that voice. She'd heard it in Ray's stories. The commander. Jet. Ray let out a laugh, a wild, triumphant sound. Took your sweet time, Jet. Then, out the shattered viewport, salvation streaked. Across the stars, a fleet, human warships, sleek and armed to the teeth, descended like steel angels from orbit, their guns blazing. Laser fire shredded the Cryan hull, slicing through the enemy like paper. The Cryans inside the shuttle froze. Then scattered. Ray grabbed Evra and pulled her close, shielding her with his body as explosions shook the docking bridge. The Cryan warship reeled under the assault, its grip faltering, its lights dimming. A final blast rocked the shuttle, and then silence. No more sirens. No more boots. Just the sound of Ray's breath and the distant rumble of the dying Cryan ship breaking apart. Evra looked up at him, her hands still clutching his armor. You did it, she whispered, voice raw. Ray grinned. No, we did. And as the human ships moved in to extract them, Evra felt something far stronger than fear rise within her. Chest. Victory. The docking clamps hissed as the shuttle sealed with the main corridor of the human warship Arclight. The hum of stabilization systems pulsed beneath the floor as pressure equalized with a gentle thunk. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evra stepped into a place not built to dissect her. The air was warm not in temperature, but in tone. It smelled faintly of oil, sweat, and metal, but none of it reeked of cruelty. A dozen armored Marines greeted them, rifles lowered. A man at the front, tall and cocky, with a 5 o'clock shadow and a scar cutting through his eyebrow, cracked a wide grin. Ray Novak, he drawled. You son of a bitch. Still rescuing. Damsels with a death wish? Ray gave him a tired smile and clapped him on the shoulder. Still flying into war zones like it's happy hour, Jet? Jet Voss chuckled, but his eyes softened when they moved to Evra. You must be the girl. Evra flinched slightly at the label, but Ray slid beside her, placing a protective hand at the small of her back. Not possessive, just grounding. She's got a name, Ray said. Evra Talon. Jet's grin faded, replaced by something more respectful. He gave her a nod. Welcome aboard, Evra. You're safe here. Safe. That word again. It tasted strange. Unfamiliar. Like something she wasn't sure she deserved. They led her and Ray to the medical bay. It was brightly lit, but not blinding. Clean, but not sterile. The medics treated her gently, murmuring comfort as they scanned her body, noting the injuries, the scarring, the lingering traces of Cryan experimentation. One nurse even paused to ask, "May I touch you?" Before adjusting the biosensor on her collarbone, Evra blinked, startled. Consent, they were asking. When it was over, they let her rest in a recovery cabin, a small private room with a narrow bed and soft lighting. Ray sat nearby, his armor peeled off in layers, now wearing a simple gray t-shirt and fatigue pants. Without the armor, he seemed less like a weapon and more like a man. Real, tangible. Tired, she lay there, staring at the ceiling until finally she whispered, "I don't know what happens next." Ray looked over, brows furrowed. "I don't know where to go," she continued. "My people are gone. My planet's dead. I have nothing." He stood slowly, walked over, and knelt beside the bed. "You have me." Evra turned to face him, eyes wide. "I'm not offering a miracle," he said quietly. "I don't have a new planet tucked in my back pocket or some secret utopia to bring you to. But I can give you this time, space, a chance to figure out what you want." "I don't know what I want," she said. "Then let's find out. Together." Her lip trembled. She hadn't cried since the day her world burned, but the tears now weren't from loss. They were from the slow, terrifying flood of something softer, something fragile. Hope. She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation, threading his fingers through hers like it had always been meant to be. Later, they walked the halls of the Arclight, watching stars spill across the panoramic. Observation deck. Evra leaned against the railing, Ray beside her, the universe stretching out before them like an invitation. "There's a refugee colony on Vega 6, Ray said. "It's peaceful. They don't care where you come from, only who you are now." She looked up at him. "And who am I now?" He met her gaze. "You're free. You're alive. You're Evra Talon." She smiled softly. "And you?" Ray shrugged. "Just the guy lucky enough to be standing next to you." The silence between them was full but no longer empty. And when she reached up and kissed him, it wasn't frantic or desperate. It was slow, gentle, a promise, not a plea. She had been broken, but standing here, under the quiet glow of alien stars, she finally understood something. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was beginning again, with him, and she was never going back. Stars drifted across the observation deck like ancient, watching eyes distant, quiet, eternal. Evra stood in the glow of them, her reflection faint in the glass, still not fully convinced it was real. That she was real. That she wasn't still strapped to a table in a Cryan lab, lost in another cruel hallucination, crafted by chemicals and machinery. But then Ray's hand found hers warm, calloused, human, and the illusion shattered in favor of something better, something true. They had been aboard the Arclight for 3 days now. In that time, Evra had walked on her own legs, eaten real food with her own hands, and slept without fear of being woken by pain. She'd spoken to people who listened, who didn't treat her like a specimen, but as someone worthy of dignity. It felt impossible. Yet it was happening. The peace was new, but the war wasn't over. That much she understood. She and Ray had been summoned to a high-security debriefing chamber on the upper deck. The walls were sleek steel, and the table glowed faintly with embedded interfaces. 2 officers sat across from them, one from the United Systems Command, the other from Human Intelligence Division. Both wore expressions carved from stone. They'd reviewed the Cryan facility data. What Ray had pulled before their escape. Files, logs, video footage of the experiments. Evra had nearly walked out when she saw herself on the screen, strapped down, screaming without sound. She hadn't cried. Not then, not in front of them. Instead, she stared down the officers with a fire in her eyes they hadn't expected. "You should know," one officer said now. "Your physiology has unique markers we've never seen. Subcellular regenerative traits. Neural patterns that mimic precursor species." "Precursor?" Ray echoed, frowning. The other officer nodded gravely. "The original sentient architects of the spiral rim. Long gone. Until now, we assumed extinct. But your genome," he looked at Evra, "shows undeniable remnants of theirs. You may be the last living bridge to an ancient race." Evra sat still. The truth echoed through her bones like the drum of war. They weren't just torturing me. They were trying to unlock something. "Which means," the first officer added, "you're a target. Not just of the Cryans, but of everyone who wants that kind of power." Ray leaned forward, voice like steel. "Then she's under my protection. Full stop." The officers exchanged a look. "We were hoping you'd say that." They offered asylum, relocation to a secure outpost. Evra was free to truly choose for the first time. But she didn't even hesitate. "I go where he goes." Ray turned to her then, eyes soft, but voice firm. "You sure?" Evra nodded. "You gave me back my name, my life. That's not something I walk away from." Later, in the quiet of their shared quarters, she watched as Ray stripped out of his armor and tossed it aside with a sigh. He looked exhausted, bruised, but safe. She walked over, barefoot on the warm floor, and laid her head against his chest. His arms wrapped around her without a word. "I used to think I was broken," she murmured. "A piece of something that would never be whole again." He rested his chin on her head. "You're not broken, Evra. You're scarred." "But that's not the same thing." They stood like that for a long time. No words needed. Just breath. Just closeness. Just the rhythm of two survivors who had found shelter in each other. Eventually, they sat together beneath the viewport, watching the stars. "Do you think we'll ever find them?" she asked softly. "Others like me?" Ray considered it. "Maybe. Maybe not. But either way, we'll find something. You and me. Out there." Evra smiled faintly. "A home?" He looked at her, blue eyes gleaming. "Not out there. Not just there." He touched her cheek softly. "I am your home. And you're mine." Evra felt her chest tighten with emotion. Not pain, not fear, but something gentler. Something she barely remembered how to name. Love, real. Steady. Unbreakable. They didn't need a planet, a city, a flag. They had each other. And in the endless stretch of stars, that was more than enough. Together, they would carve out a place in the galaxy, not just for survival, but for living. Together, they would begin again.